you now. She has, some years ago, gave a paper at the Summer Institute and then is now returning to present again. She earlier presented on Gossen. This time she's going to present on Georgescu-Roegen on Gossen. We've heard that name, the first of those names, earlier today, and Gossen has been in the mix a little bit, but it's great to have you here. And now at the University of Greenwich, so it's great that Paola's settled there. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I would like to first thank Sandra and David for giving me this opportunity to present here today, and that's all the more important to me as I'm coming back to the history of economics after a few years in which I've been working in other areas. And with a paper that I see particularly appropriate for such a summer institute, to the extent that I'm doing it's the most historical of my papers, to the extent that I'm doing the history of economics, in a sense, and the history of the work, as Sandra said already, that Georgescu-Roegen did on Gossen, about whom I presented before. Now, Georgescu-Roegen is mostly remembered today for his work on bioeconomics, sustainability, energy, these kind of issues. If you just Google his name, you will find a Facebook group on environmental issues that is entitled to Georgescu-Roegen and number of papers on these kind of matters. But he also contributed to the history of economics, and in particular with his edition of the English translation of the book of Gossen, or proto-marginalist, let's call him like that, for now, German writer who first published his book in German in the mid-19th century, and was essentially a precursor of ideas that, many of the ideas that would later be developed by Jepson, etc. I'll give a bit more detail later, but the important point I'd like to make is that this book is, with the translation, includes an introductory essay by Georgescu-Roegen with a very long development on biography of Gossen, historical context, theoretical analysis, and a broader epistemological reflection, which is, in my view, a masterpiece in the edition of economics texts and in the history of economics. And is in fact the longest and most favorable appraisal he ever wrote of any writer. It's 130 pages, so could have been a book in itself, in fact. And it's even longer than the introduction he wrote for his own book, in which he put together his essays on utility. Now, if you have a look at this essay, the immediate feeling, the immediate message that it conveys is a sense of empathy between the author and the object of his study, a sense that, well, Gossen, how many of you know much of him, that's precisely his point, it was ignored at the time in this country and continued to be ignored by many, or most, afterwards. And that's unjust because he was a great contributor to economic theory, pretty much as he, Georgescu himself, felt the profession wasn't recognizing his merits. And there are accounts by, in particular, his former colleagues at Vanderbilt University that he widely voiced his belief that he would have deserved the Nobel Prize, and he never got it, in fact. My point here, however, although all this is undoubtedly true, is that it was not only self-identification with an earlier writer that motivated Georgescu, but his original idea was to work at a new approach on utility. Georgescu had worked on utility and consumer choice theory in the first part of his career, his first 30 or so years of work. And he wanted to build on that what he had already outlined before, and with support from ideas he found in Gossen, to move forward in this area, in fact. But what happened was that completion of this project took almost 20 years and was quite complex, and this long period of time, in fact, allowed for a progressive change in focus and outlook. And what happened was that the original theoretical interests gradually vanished and left room for this personal sense of self-identification and which eventually became predominant. I will develop a little bit on the reasons why Georgescu got interested in Gossen in the first place, what his project was, and what didn't work with that. But I'll detail all that later on. I think we should now go straight into the topic and start with facts, the story. I used to reconstitute the history of the project. I used the archival materials on Georgescu-Roegen that are now at Duke University from Vanderbilt, where they were at the beginning. So if you take, let's start from the published version, the book. It's in fact a joint enterprise of Georgescu-Roegen and his colleague Rudolf Blitz, who was also an economist, was also at Vanderbilt, and was a native speaker of German. And the division of labor was that Blitz would translate, actually, and Georgescu would write the introduction. Georgescu, in fact, had apparently some command of German, but not enough to be able to read the whole book by himself, so he was dependent, in a sense, on the work of Blitz to write this essay. The book is published in 1983 by MIT Press, and as I briefly mentioned before, it's an excellent editorial work. The original German text at Gossen had no division into chapters, no labeling of figures or tables or equations, no numbering, no nothing. And they tried to put some order into the matter, together with translating into English. There was some terminological confusion that they tried to clarify. So, in fact, Georgescu contributed for these editorial aspects to the translation, even though he didn't do the text, in fact, primarily himself. But so, publication 1983, but in fact, if you look back, I could trace the project as far back as 1965. They discussed it at the AEA conference, which at the time took place at the end of December rather than the beginning of January. In fact, they almost immediately obtained a publication contract with Kelly. A few months later, they obtained funding from Vanderbilt University and the AEA, and they initially thought it wouldn't be that challenging, it wouldn't take that long, and they expected completion to take 1 year and a half before the book goes into the market, and Kelly shared these expectations. So, and actually the first draft of Blitz's translation is ready within a few months. So, okay, it was not perfect, but everything seems to be very promising. So, everything looks smooth. But was it? Because 1970, the AEA knocks on the door to ask about their money. The book is still not around. And Blitz had to reassure them, saying, no, I am on my 4th draft of the translation. I expect to complete soon. But there was still no essay, no nothing done by Georgescu at this stage. Only 1 year after that, they sent the first draft to Kelly, the publisher, for a first review. Again, without any word by Georgescu, any trace of the introduction. Actually Georgescu starts working on his essay only after receiving a key historical source from Hayek. In fact, that was a dissertation defended in Germany in the 1930s that Hayek knew about, and the author of this dissertation had used archival material from the German public administration where Gossen worked in his lifetime to reconstitute elements of his life of which nothing was known before. And on this basis, Georgescu started working. This is a picture of the very first draft of his manuscript, 1973, which is, however, quite different from the published version and incomplete. A second draft, 76, is still incomplete. And what happens at this stage is an external threat too, in that Kelly sold his firm. I don't know if you saw that, but there was discussion in the HES mailing list about that recently. They felt, in fact, they had to announce their contract. So now there's no publisher, seems hopeless. But then there's a turning point, 1981, MIT Press expresses an interest in publishing the book, and that apparently through the decisive intermediation of Paul Samuelson, with whom Georgescu had all his life, as far as I can tell, a very good relationship of friendship. I didn't find traces of that role of Samuelson in the archives, but I had the information from three different people who all knew it from Lawrence Moss. Of course, I cannot ask Samuelson now, but it seems plausible in light of their relationship. MIT Press puts a lot of pressure on Georgescu to finalize his work so that they can go on with the publication. Hayek is the reviewer nominated by MIT Press for the work, and Hayek himself, in fact, wrote an introduction to the, I think, third German edition of Gossen's work in 1927, I believe. But it's a very short one, just summary of what was known about Gossen. It's very conventional introduction, and in his letter to Georgescu of this period, he says, "Oh, I really congratulate you for the excellent work you did on Gossen. When I had this opportunity, I was busy with many things and didn't really make an effort to do it better. I did a very basic work, but now I understand that there was material to develop there." Which is quite interesting. And finally, the book comes out. Now, all that I think can be explained. I mean, we don't have to look very far for the reasons why all this happened. A number of practical factors were around, the linguistic barrier, and the fact that Blitz, in fact, found the translation much more challenging than he had anticipated at the beginning, so it took him longer than he initially expected. And of course, Georgescu depended on his work to start it, so that delayed him. They lost the contract with Kelly, so that must, of course, have lowered motivation. In this period, Georgescu was also working at his research on bioeconomics, his book on the entropy laws of 1971, and he continued publishing that area afterwards. So, of course, this created competing commitments. And I mean, all that is quite enough to explain what happened. But my point is not to explain why all this was delayed so much, but the fact to look at the implications of this delay on the attitude that Georgescu had towards Gossen, and now it could change over such a long period of time. And I'm showing it changed in two ways. First, the first one is that personal motive of self-identification and the rationalization of that is now found in the published edition is something that appears late. If you open now the published book, Georgescu's essay opens with what he calls an exordium on are there minds that may think of all their times. And the point really, I mean, in a nutshell, is we see in Schumpeter's history of economic analysis that there might be economists that think of all their times, but this is against the sociology of knowledge of Merton, again something from the 70s, that predicts discovery as something that results from the conditions that society prepares for it. So it comes when times are right for it, and in that sense, it's more likely to observe multiple discoveries rather than single ones. I feel that Georgescu strongly criticized it's interesting the example he gives. It's okay, that means like if there was no Shakespeare, we still would have Hamlet, which is not even science, but still. And more seriously, his point is that discovery is something complex, and even things that look at first sight the same may not be. And this example is the marginalist revolution. We have the ability to say that Jepson and the Barras did this thing, but if we look a bit closer, we see that there are strong differences between the three. And in fact, this point is really to say that that yes, there are minds that think about their times, and they are likely to face hostility or misunderstanding or neglect and oblivion, as was the case with Gossen. All this, that makes 20 pages of writing, so it's quite a long development with a lot of examples and citations from the sociology of science and epistemology. And all this is absent from the early draft, so it must have been added when he got the publication contract from MIT, 1982, 1983, just before publication. And the interesting thing is not just that he regrets that Gossen had been neglected. This is expressed even before. He always thought that it was bad that the economics profession had forgotten about Gossen. But the point really is that at the beginning it was more a reflection on the unique fate of one particularly unlucky man. While this switch to the sociology of science suggests that there may be some regularity behind that, something more general going on. And in this sense, all minds that think about their times might be concerned, including Georgescu himself. So in this sense, that's a more general way of thinking about the fate of Gossen as something that is not a unique historical event, but can be more general and can be shared by others, including possibly himself. The other point I want to make about this evolution of this thought is that, in fact, if this sense of self-identification corroborated by an analysis comes late, in fact, Georgescu's admiration for Gossen's theory is something that was stronger at the beginning. Let's just look, that's one particular point, nothing more, but I think it's suggestive and it's interesting. Gossen wrote in the preface of his book this sentence: I believe I have accomplished for the explanation of the relations among humans what a Copernicus was able to accomplish for the explanation of the relations of the heavenly bodies. And I see everybody smiling. I think it's the most common reaction to that. But let's see what Georgescu's comment was to that in his manuscripts. And I took a picture of that because I thought if I just say it, they will believe me. The claim is to offer the substance of a good joke. Well, yes. Yet, in this case, the joke should turn against those who may have joked about Gossen's claim. It is, underlined, is the Copernicus of economics. Which is like, wow, quite strong. This is found, say, identical in 1973 and in 1976. but disappears from the published version, which takes a much more moderate tone in referring to the same point. And again, that's just an example, but perhaps in a more general perspective, it can be shown that it's thinking about Gossen, and in terms of the theory, of economic theory, is concentrated in the years end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, when the project was starting. I have compared here the timing of the book project, which, as I said, started in 1965. He writes these two drafts, 73 and 76, and then completed 83, to the mentions of Gossen in other essays and articles that he published elsewhere. And there is a first mention very early on in the 50s, but it's just very brief, it's like alpha line, nothing special. There is another one, 1985, in an Italian journal, but in fact it's just a reprint of part of the introductory essay in the book, so it's nothing really new. And in fact, most of its reflections in these three articles between 68 and 73, which in fact, I mean, I could infer from the correspondence that they fit pretty much into what would then be the drafts of the introductory essay and vice versa. So the bulk of his thinking about Gossen in theoretical terms is in this period. But of course, then the point is, why was he interested in Gossen at all? What motivated him in the first place to look at this theory? So to do that, I've been looking at the articles that Georgescu published in the first years of his career about utility and consumer choice, to find out what his problems were. So I just summarize in a nutshell without details to come to the point. But the first point, he had worked on the so-called integrability problem, how to recover utility indexes and difference curves from the actual observed equilibrium condition of the consumer, and found in a famous 1936 article that it's not generally possible unless we assume that preferences are transitive. But his point was to say that this is an assumption that requires strong, something very restrictive on the human cognitive capabilities, we would say today. And his point was to say that, in fact, humans aren't necessarily able to compare all values of goods across all possible changes of quantities of the different goods that go in them. They have a sort of what he calls a psychological threshold of perceptions. Their capacity to compare is limited, in fact. And on this basis, he suggested to, in fact, develop a different theory according to which indifference curves are not just given once and for all, and choice is not something that, as is conventional theory, something that he compares to the view of a bird who is above the ground and sees everything below, chooses the most preferred spot and just goes there. So wherever he is in the choice space, he's always in equilibrium. But he says we should rather, this is unlikely to be realistic, and to build a more realistic theory of how people really make choices, it's more appropriate to think of the choice of a word. It can be anywhere at the beginning in the choice space, including in a disequilibrium position, choose a direction and move along that, because he only sees the surroundings, but not everything. And that was the idea. So it's a sense of whatever comes first is an experience of consumption that determines how future preferences and choices will be like. It's not something that is given once and for all. You need time to allow the consumer to progress, in fact, in the sequence of choices. And it continues along this thinking that is based on time and experience and learning. It doesn't use the word learning, but I think it would be quite appropriate. when he afterwards works on lexicographic preferences, which he thinks are quite plausible, and they in fact represent the idea that needs are not all reducible to one thing that we call utility and would cover everything. He gives examples like, if I'm hungry, I don't want another t-shirt, or if I'm thirsty, I don't want food. It's different things that have different priorities, and we should rather think of consumption as starting from basic needs and moving then on to higher level needs. But this, of course, implies that there can be paths in consumption choices, starting from the most basic needs, food and drink, and moving on to the higher ones. And again, if this is the case, we have a mechanism through which past choices affect current and future choices now, even if preferences don't change, but the starting point changes, so choice can be different over time. And of course, the big issue is that lexicographic preferences are the classical example of a case in which traditional utility theory doesn't work well. It's the textbook example of when it doesn't work. So basically, his point was really that it was important to better integrate time into economic analysis, and it makes this point very forcefully in his 1968 entry on utility in the International Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences. More broadly, was dissatisfied with other aspects of consumer theory as it was. The indifference notion was something that he considered completely flawed, and he here and there expresses the idea that after all the move to the ordinal approach with Pareto from the order cardinality and all that wasn't such a big progress as we usually thought. We still have concepts that are problematic, in fact. But the key issue really is time, because all the questions of paths of consumption, what we would call today path dependency, experience as a determinant of preferences and learning are related to having time, which is interesting to understand because it's also something that we find in his work on entropy, the arrow of time, and which will lead into all these discussions of growth, all that in this other part of his work. Now, all this wasn't completely achieved because all the evidence he had was from, in fact, just introspection. He thought about, he spoke about the psychological threshold, but what's the evidence for that? He says it's just introspection. And of course, he's aware of the limits of that. He never made a very strong case of what we would gain by switching, by developing, in fact, from scratch his idea of directional choice theory rather than sticking to the good old indifference curves that were there before. It developed as, he increasingly criticized the use of abstract mathematics in economics, but never, at least in this area, never proposed any alternative approach. So all this was somehow incomplete. And so what kind of insight, in light of all this background, could a proto-marginalist author such as Gossen offer? Well, what do we find in Gossen? First, a version of the usual decreasing marginal utility principle. The interesting thing with respect to what Georgescu had in mind is that Gossen had developed it first with respect to time, the enjoyment that an activity yields when it is done over a period of time increases at a decreasing rate, and then extended it later to commodities. And the issue that Gossen's approach, in fact, that was something that we found interesting, is not strictly speaking a cardinalist approach, but sort of in the middle between the two. It well, Gossen provided a simple device to find an optimum that Georgescu liked because it didn't imply a different scores. But the key, that's not the key thing in my view. In my view, the very important point is where Georgescu himself labeled Gossen's second law, and which is in fact a second mechanism for diminishing utility. I read from the translation: if a previous enjoyment is repeated after an interruption, the intensity of pleasure schedule shifts downwards depending on the individual's previous experiences of enjoyment. The sooner the repetition, the larger the shift. And in fact, that means that past experiences change utility preferences, if we want to use the terminology rather. And Georgescu, which was pretty much in line with what Georgescu had already been thinking about, and he was the first to draw attention to this principle that had gone pretty much unnoticed with previous commentators, and that he thought could be something very new and very important. What he says, when he speaks about the Copernicus of economics, in fact, what he says is that, yes, Gossen anticipated marginalist principles that we would find elsewhere too, but this point, this mechanism here is unique. It's something that he discovered and nobody else has ever developed any further, and that's something really new that opens the way to new developments. And Gossen even suggests, just verbally, with no, this picture here is in Gossen's book. Gossen adds that there might be some way in which we optimize some new time use over one's lifespan if we know that, actually by deciding the frequency at which we can repeat a given activity or a given enjoyment over time, we can obtain the highest pleasure by minimizing, in fact, the shifts downwards of the curve. And Georgescu tried to develop that and see if he could come to a general theorem or a general proposition mathematically with that. That's in the drafts from the beginning and in the published version. So overall, there was an affinity between Gossen, who had emphasized time so much, and especially with this principle here, and Georgescu, who had suggested the importance of working on time before. Even though more generally, Georgescu was so enthusiastic in these years about Gossen that he referred even to more, I would say more basic parts of his work. The optimum diagram, the one that I showed before, which, this one, is something that, for example, he referred to in a letter to Samuelson in 1974 to criticize a point in a draft paper that Samuelson had sent to him for comments. So just to give a sense of how much he had this in mind. The point is that Georgescu didn't find a general solution to the problem found outlining Gossen of optimizing time use over one's lifespan. He didn't find many suggestions on how to make the case for an alternative theory of consumer choice with time at its core. He didn't develop new methods either, because Gossen is very basic mathematics, and although he did use some findings from the psychology of his time, it doesn't give precise references, so it doesn't allow a reader to do much beyond introspection, in fact, which is what Georgescu already did before. And of course, a number of the problems of earlier marginalist theories were still there. As in Jepson said, as in all the others. So it's in this sense, it was not really the kind of improvement he hoped for. No, so it's in the end, it's something that he explored, but again, only to an extent, and didn't really allow him to make the progress that would have been needed to really develop his initial intuitions about time experience and learning in consumer choice. What I would just mention briefly before concluding is the fact that precisely in this period and at the end of this period, end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, it's the moment in which new approaches to consumer choice in particular start to see the light. And they are completely independent of what Georgescu was doing with Gossen, but would bring change into economic theory. What I have in mind is primarily behavioral economics. The first key articles are in this period, the main development is afterwards. But in fact, what first I found very striking when I looked at Gossen's second law is that it accounts somehow for some of the issues that are in fact accounted for in a completely different way of perspective by the principles of reference dependence and adaptation. The fact that we adjust that, for example, pretty much used in happiness research to understand why levels of happiness are not necessarily much higher when income goes up. That's a matter of adaptation, and the fact that people compare themselves with a reference level and not absolute measures. Now, of course, this is something that, as I said, it's unrelated, developed through a different path, but they provide a framework, its own framework, to account for past dependency of choices. This is something that developed new methods using forms of empirical evidence, and in particular experiments, rather than introspection. And that over time, not immediately in that period, but over time gained ground in the economics profession and became recognized. So in a sense, it's like Georgescu had seen some of the issues that were also seen by behavioral economists and developed in a different way by them. I did not find any evidence that he was aware of their results during the last part of his life and scientific production, even though some commentators have pointed to similarities between the concerns of Georgescu and Kahneman and others. What I know, however, is that it was quite skeptical. It was not unaware, and it was quite skeptical of experiments as a method. In his 1936 article on utility, he has a footnote in which he mentioned one of the earliest experiments in these economics by Thurston, which was precisely on the existence of indifference curves. And he says, yes, there is this experiment, but he makes a number of points according to which it's not completely reliable in terms of results for its design and a number of issues. Of course, this was a very, can be taken as a very rudimentary example. It was one of the first and pioneering effort in using experiments in demand theory. His comments were quite skeptical, even though open somehow to, let's see if it's not that experiments will never work, but this one I don't trust its results. And afterwards, I have been told, I haven't found any other reference, but I've been told by Kozo Mayumi, who is a student of Georgescu and was at Vanderbilt in the 80s, that in fact one of the reasons why he withdrew from the AEA was that he learned about the experiments with rats that Deirdre mentioned the other day. So, again, that was a very particular strand of experiments. Not all of them are with animals, but again, suggests a sort of skepticism towards the methodology. So, in fact, it's like, yes, in a sense, he did think about his time. He did conceive of developments about issues that weren't there, but he was somehow unable to bring all these ideas to full development, and they remained somehow somehow undeveloped, in fact. While some of the key points that he had stressed were independently rediscovered elsewhere. So it's sort of vindication of Merton, the idea that we are more likely to see multiple discoveries rather than singletons. And in a sense, that seems to somehow suggest that Georgescu had reasons to express the bitter feelings that are now found in his, in the introduction to Gossen, though it becomes less clear whether it's because his work hadn't progressed as much as it could have, perhaps, or because it wasn't sufficiently recognized, or he didn't find fertile ground. But the sense of empathy is perhaps more understandable in this respect, I believe. And I think I'll conclude here.
Paola, I really enjoyed the account because it seemed to be quite objective, since we didn't only relate the story of Genussen from the perspective of Georgescu, but also the criticism of this theory, which sounded like healthy criticism to me. And all those issues you touched upon, behavioral economics, that were developing in interrelation at that time, are quite interesting too. And I would say that at times, Georgescu, instead of spending all this time on making Genussen really proving that Genussen was the Copernicus of economics, he could have made some advancements or discoveries in economics himself, but instead it seems almost like he was so preoccupied with Genussen that he spent perhaps all his life doing that. But anyway, it was really great lecture to me.
Yeah, no, but in that same period, he developed all his work on, which I haven't covered here at all, on bioeconomics and law of entropy and all that. So he did innovate, but not much in this area. In fact, it's another field. So it's this area that remained underdeveloped, and certainly his other interests may have competed with that in terms of requiring time and effort.
Yeah, I think your very interesting account it should be put beside Till's as it was, because they're both examples of how to start. I don't think either of you gotten as far as you could, although they're both excellent papers, on a rhetoric of economic science. That is, how scientists persuade each other. What causes Arrow to prove to be a gigantically successful scientific program at any rate in terms of Nobel Prizes. And Georgescu's work, at least on consumption theory, to be unsuccessful. And we have a tendency to think, well, it's the inherent merit of the science that determines whether one scientific program succeeds over another. And as I argued in the last session, I regard Georgescu's approach to behavioral economics, which is essentially what it is, to be a much more fruitful and successful scientific theory than general equilibrium, which I think I've made clear what my opinions are. But so it's not that the truth will out. It's that it's scientists, scholars, politicians, married people, whatever. Humans argue with each other, and the kinds of figures of speech they use, the kinds of appeals to authority they use, the fashionability or unfashionability of their techniques, all these are their connections. I mean, Ken Arrow is a splendid man. I wouldn't say the same of his collaborator, but Arrow is a splendid man with tremendous connections. I suppose you all know that he's Paul Samuelson's brother-in-law. Are you aware of that? Yes. Kenneth Arrow was Paul Samuelson's brother-in-law. So there's a substantial case to be made that modern economics is that one family. And Larry Summers, the Secretary of the Treasury, and World Bank and all that, Harvard, the youngest professor of economics ever at Harvard, full professor of economics, is their nephew, their mutual nephew. It's obviously the same, but okay. So it's about rhetoric, it's about persuasion. How do you feel about that?
I think I think you're right. That's an excellent suggestion. By the way, there's been a dissertation, not a graduate dissertation, but pretty good, by a student of Roy Weintraub, who looked at not this part of Georgescu's production, but his work on entropy and the communication he had with scientists for the publication of his papers in that area. And the point he was making was precisely that communication between them ran so badly that it determined the misunderstandings that, I mean, we all know about. It's not just a failure on the reception side, but it was a reciprocal series, in fact, of mutual misunderstandings that determined that. So it's quite, I mean, plausible that this might have happened in this other area too.
There are speakers and there are hearers.
Yes.
There's rhetoric and there's hermeneutics, and they both change the course of science.
Before the talk, you told me about the connection between the work that you discussed and Georgescu's more famous work. And the connection I saw was one of time. But I would also say, and this is to me very, very important, what Georgescu did went well beyond bioeconomics in making this distinction between funds and flows. And that extends all the way into capital theory. And it sits like a landmine under price theory, because unless you can value capital, unless you have a way of valuing capital, then all thought of price theory goes through the roof. It doesn't make sense unless you're dealing with capital that has a lifetime of one period.
I don't understand this. Michael, I don't know what you're talking about. Could you make it clearer in a few sentences, a couple of sentences? Yeah, I'm very interested to know. I don't know what you're saying.
Yes, I think, let me take a second then. Or should I tell you afterwards, because this is Paula's time. But briefly, what I'll tell you is if you're going to value capital, you have to know the value of that capital, and that you have to deal with the depreciation associated with the two.
That's the Cambridge controversy. I understand that.
No, it's not Cambridge controversy.
It's not Cambridge controversy.
Not Cambridge controversy at all. It's how you value a stock that you use over time.
Okay.
Cambridge controversy has no time whatsoever.
Yeah.
So Georgescu-Roegen is way ahead of that. How do you deal with it over time? The way we deal with it is we either look at historical costs, which are irrelevant, that is, your old computers not worth it, or you deal with accounting, and Hicks did really good work in talking about accountants look backwards, economists have to look forwards. He was dealing with the same thing.
Thank you for a very interesting paper. You've done a nice reflexive move here. You've taken a genre in the history of economics, which is the unduly neglected figure, and shown that the unduly neglected figure was interested in another unduly neglected figure. That's terrific. That's terrific. Two really brief, one brief comment and a question on the behavioralism link. It's funny when Gossen regards himself as Copernicus, because it seems like an outlandish claim, but it's also maybe what Georgescu meant in endorsing the claim was that he was misunderstood. It's not a matter of hubris, but Copernicus was misunderstood by a very important group, namely the church. So that, I don't know, but that's an interesting angle into what Georgescu meant in endorsing the claim, this notion of being misunderstood, which has a lot to do with, I think you call it being of your time as opposed to being ahead of your time, which is an interesting change of perspective. Here's my question. On the link to behavioral, would Georgescu have known of Strotz's 1954 paper on dynamic inconsistency? This is, Strotz, I guess, is the editor in Till's drama, too, somewhere in there. And so the idea is that we discount more heavily in the near future than the far future. It's the workhorse of many behavioral economics models today. It's Jepson's model.
Hyperbolic.
Sometimes hyperbolic, but it addresses the time issue that Georgescu made central in his 1954, so he might well have encountered it and had something to say about it if you want to make a link to the behavioral first. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, thanks a lot. And this second law of diminishing marginal utility brings to mind a difficulty that I run into in trying to explain the law of diminishing marginal utility to students. Because we're talking about changing the rate of consumption of a good, and rates have to do with time. But we're doing it without time. And students often, I think, naturally somehow go to what he was talking about, changing the length of time between bites of ice cream. I think that's what you're talking about. And in a sense, if that's what you're doing, that can be a change in the rate of consumption. You know, if we have time, if we change the number of bites of ice cream we take per hour, we're diminishing the period of time between bites. But we do that in a timeless world. And that's a puzzle to me. And I never know if I really am able to explain it properly to students, because I think they're onto, and this makes me think the students are onto something when they ask that question.
Yeah, I think the students have a point, because if I see, I mean, in all the articles that I mentioned, Georgescu struggles with precisely this issue of the rate of consumption and what assumptions we should make about that, and it's not completely clear. So I think he was struggling a lot with this issue himself, and that's perhaps one of the things that remained unsolved in the end, that remained there.
Just a brief question. As far as I got it correctly, you said that Hayek edited Gossen in the 20s.
Mm-hmm.
So can you say, do you know why he discovered Gossen, what the relationship between Gossen and Menger might be? Thank you.
Yeah, very briefly, from what, so I had read this introduction of Hayek to this earlier edition of Gossen, and that's quite, I mean, brief and basic, in fact. And what Hayek says in his letter to Georgescu is that the publisher had asked him, and he found sort of, he was socially, under a social obligation to say yes. But apparently it came at a moment where he had so many commitments and other things that he didn't really do, and he did a sort of a minimum. So I don't think he developed a very strong interest for Gossen. He did it because he had to, basically, but never went very far into his knowledge of Gossen, and the fact that, in fact, it was he who supplied this key source, this ordered dissertation to Georgescu, it seems to have been a matter of coincidence. He knew someone who had given him a number of dissertations before the war, I think, and he had deposited all that in the library of his university. So he knew that it was there, but it was something that had happened to be in his hands without him actively looking for that. So I don't think it was really, he had a strong motivation. I'm not aware that Menger knew anything of Gossen. Valras did, and in fact, by the way, the author of the French language translation of Gossen is Valras. And that also is something that had a very convoluted story, because the manuscript was lost, and Georgescu was aware of that. They tried to look for it. They even discovered where it actually was, but didn't get hold of that, and the manuscript was rediscovered and published in the mid-90s in France.
Charlie, yes, just briefly.
I asked her to come in.
On this point, Hayek had a sort of commitment with a publisher in order to reprint German economic theory. And so he started with Gossen, then he went to go on with Menger. And when he wrote the introduction of Menger, Grundsätze, he tried to find a link between Menger and Gossen. But the most amazing thing is that Gossen, it was never mentioned in Grundsätze. So it was a sort of a pressure in Hayek perspective, in a Hayek idea to link these two theories. But you know better than me that in Menger, the most important influence is from the German historical school, even if there was that struggle, the methodological struggle. But indeed, absolutely, Menger never recognized himself as a heir of Gossen, never.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, this is kind of one way, it's a question running through my mind, which did it make any difference in Gossen's impact that it took so long before it was translated into English? And apparently the answer is sort of no. Menger was not picking up on it, but it still raises the issue of why didn't he have more, Gossen didn't have more influence in the German-speaking world. One issue, Menger had a big influence, as you're saying, the historical school conflict. Menger had students and so on, was Gossen himself sort of more isolated, not having, and then of course you can do the same thing about Georgescu-Roegen. I mean, one way you could document some of this is do some sort of citation analysis on Gossen. Do things change when he is translated into English?
That would be interesting, yeah.
Oh, I think this is just terrific. When I get back home, I've got a note from a co-author which asks, did Wickstein read Gossen? Because there's lots, one of the t-shirt from last year You know, this
These are the historical documents.
these are theorems, baby. The proof is coming along a little bit later, but the theorem we had on last year was we get what we paid for without getting what we wanted.
Stefan, is that it?
That's right.
Did you have last year's on?
Yeah, that's
2 years ago.
Yeah, that's a good thing.
Oh, you're right, it's sort of red.
It's a cardinal one.
Yeah.
And one of the ways you can think about this is the kind of setup they're working with. There's no guarantee that you're going to get to a global optimum. You may get to a global optimum. And that's the cutting difference between the worm's eye view and the bird's eye view. The worm's eye view is you're going to get to a global optimum, but that isn't, there's no particularly nice properties of global optimum. A non-local optimum can be higher than a local optimum, so why do you want that? And so that to get to where we want to go, we need stronger stuff, and that's where convexity comes in, because local stuff goes global with that. And so I think that you see these puzzles, which are maybe local, global. I mean, that's not how the behaviorists like to call it. They're sort of thinking about it that way. And it's sort of the question of 2 weeks deep in Gossen. It looks deep practically everything. It's plausible that he did this, and but that would be to check out. And also, finally, the sort of following up on Deirdre's point is maybe the importance of schools in economics is if we don't have a school, we're going to end up like Gossen. That to make a difference in the world, you have to at least persuade a couple people around you, and then the group goes out and persuades people. Isolated individuals of arbitrary creativity in retrospective importance just don't succeed the way industrious and energetic groups give. Yeah, I mean, well, in the group, in the school, you may have a politician, you may have a Greg Lewis who holds your feet to the fire. There may be people internally who are important, and there may be the salesman, so you have division of labor, you have specialization in the group, and the group as a whole becomes a change agent in the way that somebody like Gossen just becomes an unbearably sad case.
Well, you think of Chicago without Milton. Imagine that Milton had, didn't exist. The Chicago school would have developed in a very different way, because as someone was saying this morning, Milton was kind of the PR man, and absolutely essential to it. And then he did very good scientific work as well, so that was nice, but he was the PR man. So he persuaded. I remember when I was a student at Harvard, and the best way of raising a laugh in a Harvard classroom in the early 60s was to mention the name of Milton Friedman. You didn't have to say anything. You didn't have to argue with this short man. You didn't deal with him in any way. You just laughed at him. Now this is ridiculous. This is one of the best economic scientists in the world. Even then, people knew if they read a theory of the consumption function, they knew that this was one of the best economic scientists around. And then it changed, partly because of the success of the monetary history.
The thing is, people did know enough about Gossen to want to translate him, and I know, his books, first editions of his books go for tons of money and all that. I mean,
David would know.
If you look at the rare book catalogs, I mean, he wasn't completely obscure in that sense. So can you elaborate more on that? Why did people know enough about him?
People knew very little, in fact. I mean, the source.
But the one he translated into English, the one about her.
So, something that I found intriguing, but I couldn't find enough, information, was that parallel project started at pretty much the same, early early 70s at the University of Missouri to translate Gossen, but they found out that Georgescu was doing that and stopped the project before it was too late. So that suggests that there was an interest by others to work on this author too. But I couldn't find out more about that. By that time, I mean, when they started this work, the only translation that was actually available was the Italian one, because the French one was still lost, would be found later. And the only literature available was no historical sources, no nothing. They go to, I mean, Blitz, not Georgescu, but he goes to Germany to find out, see if he finds some relatives, information, portraits, nothing.
What about George Katona? Did George Katona know anything about Gossen? Because comes to mind as well.
I haven't found any reference. I checked, but I haven't found any references so far.
Just a quick follow-up on this. I remember that in the second edition, the preface to the second edition of Theory of Political Economy, Jepson tells a really convoluted story of how he tried to get a handle of a German copy of Gossen's book, and he just couldn't. And I think MacLeod had a copy, and then MacLeod actually reported to him what was the content of the book, and he cited MacLeod's version of what Gossen had said. So I think even German copies were really rare at that time. And the funny thing is that Jepson was absolutely in love with Gossen without even ever had read the book. So.
It was Jepson who let us know.
Yeah, exactly.
It was in this way, and yes, the story is, but I think it's unverified, that Gossen had remaining copies of his book destroyed because it was totally unsuccessful, so even before he died. But again, that's the sort of our humor, in fact, nothing more.
Is there any connection between Gossen and the early German experimental psychologists?
I think there is, even though the evidence is sparse again, because there's very little biographical material available, but some of the things he says really remind of the work that was being done in Germany at that time.
I'm thinking actually of the other direction of influences, Gossen, the psychologists, and read Gossen. Because I'm thinking that the psychologists are a little late. Let's see.
And of the...
When is Gossen?
1854.
Yeah, well, that's before the psychologists. The psychologists are in the 1860s, aren't they?
Yeah.
Does anyone know?
Yes, it's that period.
Yeah, even later.
It's that period and later. There was some work that already started before.
Yeah, I mean it had.
But the great developments are 10 years and more later. So there might have been some connections there.
Because then that would be a sort of nice story, because then it eventuates in experimental economics because it goes through psychology.
And there are similarities. Yeah, there are similarities in fact, so it would be plausible.